Hello and welcome to another video by the Dorky Equine. Today's video is on the topic of budget gaming and how well a modestly spec'd PC can hang with typical day-to-day workloads and gaming usage. The budget for this build is in the neighborhood of around $240, or the price of your average used video game console. We'll be documenting whether this setup is good for everyday usage and if it is a viable replacement for a gaming console. This is a socket LGA 1366 build with the processor being an Intel Xeon X5550. Codenamed Nehalem, this processor was launched in Q1 of 2009 according to Intel's ARC, and has 4 cores with hyperthreading for a total of 8 logical cores. I've been told multiple times by different people that Xeons are in fact not for gaming. Well, for the cost of $7 plus free shipping, I decided to see if this was in fact true. In theory, since the Xeon was released in Q1 of 2009 on a 45nm process with 8MB of cache, technically this Xeon would be an i7-960 with ECC support enabled. The memory this time around is in a 3x2GB configuration of ECC DDR3 1333MHz. This much RAM costs an average of $20 at the usual used hardware sites. No, I did not purchase 6GB specifically, it is just what I happened to have lying around at the time. The motherboard for this build is something I happened across. It's an Asus P6T6 WS Revolution and was told in fact that the motherboard was dead. Turns out they were only partially wrong. The i7-970 that was in this motherboard was faulty and the motherboard was just fine. This motherboard does not come particularly cheap on eBay, but if you were to substitute in any old LGA 1366 motherboard, it would not affect the performance as we are not overclocking this time around and do not need any special features such as SLI. Speaking of graphics, the graphics card. We are running a single card this time, a reference NVIDIA GTX 770. This card is a powerhouse of a card at this price point, a mere $80 average on eBay, and I only wish that the 770 would have come with more than 2GB of VRAM, as this is still an excellent graphics card even today. On to the gaming benchmarks. The first game on our list is the lightweight yet visually pleasing Car Mechanic Simulator 2015. On high settings with a resolution of 1920x1080, we see an extremely high peak figure of over 320 frames per second with 1% lows in the low 90s. This is the first game I have tested on one of these machines where a high refresh rate monitor would actually be a benefit, as the frame rate is high enough to support it. Moving on, we have Beamng Drive, a game that unfortunately was too heavy on CPU to be able to be tested in my previous Core 2 Extreme video. Launching the game with that computer would result in a game immediately crashing, even at stock frequencies. Loading it up here, we can see what a difference 2 years can make, as not only can it load it, but on 1920x1080 medium quality with anti-aliasing on, we see a frame rate in the high 40s, peaking in the low 60s. No major stuttering or lag occurred and the gameplay was generally enjoyable. War Thunder was another game where we saw pleasing results. The tank's CPU battle benchmark scored an official average of 68.7 frames per second with a minimal score at 57.1. This is personally astounding as I have witnessed more modern CPUs running this benchmark below these scores. The regular tank battle benchmark hit an average of 102.8 FPS and a minimal score of 87.6. The lag and stuttering that were occurring with the Core 2 are all but non-existent this time around, indicating a much more stable gaming experience. The same story is to be had with the Pacific Day benchmark, where the average was a whopping 183.2 FPS with the minimal sitting at a lofty 113.4. The CPU is obviously much better suited to this game than the previous one. The last War Thunder performance test that was run was a realistic battle just to see if the benchmark results tied into an actual decent gaming experience. In battle, we see averages in the low 80s, high 70s, with peaks as high as 117 frames per second with no stuttering. Even in aerial combat, things stay smooth under fire, a notable choking point last time around. Skyrim was a game where, due to the physics cap on frame rate, we saw a smooth and steady 60 frames per second Ultra 1920x1080, never once dipping below that threshold even in combat. Call of Duty Black Ops 2 ran quite nicely on 1920x1080, high, no surprise there, where highs in the 160s with dips into the high 70s were experienced and gameplay was quick and fluid. Saving the best for last in the gaming scores lineup, we have Grand Theft Auto 5. The first test was run on 1920x1080, normal settings, or GTA's equivalent to low, and I will be honest, I did not expect anything near what the results were. A peak FPS figure of 118.6 was achieved and the frame rate only took a dip into the sub 60 numbers at the end with the tanker scene, where 58 frames per second were seen. This result was so surprising that just for kicks, I cranked everything up to high and gave it another shot. This time around the average was in the 70s, peak figure hit 84.2 and the low was an acceptable 44 frames. This just goes to show what an exceptional graphics card the GTX 770 is for being able to handle this game at these frame rates and resolutions. On to the productivity benchmarks, starting with Cinebench R15. The multi-core score is a respectable 472, and while that's not outstanding compared to modern high-end desktop and overclocked 8-core and above CPUs, keep in mind that this still outpaces our hilariously overclocked quad-core build, and the CPU is again $7. Not a bad value if you ask me. The CPU Mark benchmark netted a score in the 45th percentile compared to worldwide scores, and I would consider this a sweet spot as far as desktop and light productivity goes. User Benchmark ironically gave this rig a speedboat rating, despite the fact that the PC outperforms our Core 2 Extreme in almost every application we put them together in. This goes to show how skewed User Benchmark is towards GPU power, as the Core 2 build netted a whopping aircraft carrier score on gaming, due to its twin GTX 980 Ti's that we now know barely even used. It is worth noting that the SSD scores between the two platforms. The same SSD was used on both systems, but the SSD score increased more than 10% this round due to a more updated SATA connection, just as I had predicted. In conclusion, a more than decent gaming setup can be had for on the cheap if you have the knowledge and DIY spirit to dive into the world of used parts and be able to discern what is useful and what isn't. Would I recommend to someone go out and purchase this build? Actually, surprisingly yes, which is something I wasn't expecting to say when I started this project. The price to performance aspect of this computer is just too good to ignore, especially if you're on a tight budget but are looking for a computer to game with and do light productivity on. As long as you are a savvy eBay purchaser, you can end up walking away with more than the average build for console prices. Of course, granted, it will not be that, quote, it just works experience that consoles have, but that is not why you're here viewing this video anyway. This is the Dork Equine signing off on another successful build video. I think this might just become a new hobby for me.